Okay, for us to better understand this particular passage, here was the background during the time. Okay, here was the context for us to fully appreciate this. The general social structure during the Roman Empire were composed of what? Masters and slaves. Human slavery during the time really grew in numbers. When the Romans started to conquer the world, and since the Romans was such a powerful empire, every time they conquered a place, they would have an abundance of what we call today POWs, prisoners of war. They were so strong that they would conquer a land and they would have so many prisoners of war. And what did they do? What did they do to these prisoners or prisoners of war or slaves? They brought them into slavery. That was why there were a lot of slaves during the time. Now, there were those slaves who were loved, okay? Let's not always think that all the slaves were maltreated. No, there were those slaves who were loved. There were also slaves who were close to families whom they served. But there were also slaves who were not treated well. Now, in spite of the fact that some of them were treated well, in spite of that truth, the Romans didn't consider a slave as a person. Again, slaves were not people, they were not persons. They were considered what? As a thing. They considered a slave as a thing. That was why, being a thing, not a person, slaves had no legal rights. There were no legal suits possible that a slave could file. There was nothing a slave could do to protect himself from abuse, all because a slave was not considered a person. He or she was a thing. No legal rights. There was no justice system for them. Aristotle even wrote that a slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. So that was the context of a slave during the time. In fact, they could do anything with a slave. If they didn't like anymore a slave, they could just dispose the slave, and they could even just kill the slave for no